What would you do if the people who were supposed to protect you looked at the price of your life and decided it was too expensive? That question might sound impossible. The kind of thing that only happens in movies. But for 17-year-old Lena Carter, it happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and quiet fear. And the strangest part? The money was never actually the problem. But we'll get to that. Because what happened in that hospital room started with a normal day, the kind of day that doesn't feel important until everything suddenly goes wrong. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Lena Carter was a senior at Brookfield High School in Chicago. 17 years old. Debate team captain. The kind of student teachers trusted and classmates quietly admired. Her future looked mapped out. College applications submitted. Scholarships lined up. A possible pre-med track because she'd always been fascinated by how the human body worked. Ironically, that curiosity would soon become very personal. That morning started normally. First period English. Second period calculus. Then debate practice after lunch. And that's when it happened. At first it was just a dull pain in her stomach. Nothing dramatic. The kind of ache you might ignore if you've skipped breakfast. Lena tried to push through it. But within 20 minutes the pain changed. Sharp. Sudden. Like someone twisting something inside her. Her debate partner noticed first. "Lena, are you okay?" Lena tried to answer. But instead she doubled over. The room went quiet. One student called the school nurse. Another called 911. 10 minutes later Lena was in the back of an ambulance, staring at the ceiling lights sliding past above her as the vehicle rushed through traffic. And in that moment, she had no idea that this medical emergency would reveal a secret about her family that had been hidden for 17 years. At St. Augustine Medical Center, the emergency room moved quickly. Doctors asked questions. Nurses took blood. Machines beeped softly around her bed. The physician on duty was Dr. Emily Chin, a calm and focused emergency doctor who had worked there for nearly a decade. After a CT scan and several tests, Dr. Chin returned with a serious expression. "Lena," she said gently, "you have a small intestinal obstruction. It's rare at your age, but it happens. The good news is we caught it early." Lena blinked slowly. "So, what does that mean?" Dr. Chin didn't sugarcoat it. "It means you'll likely need surgery within the next 24 hours. Surgery. The word echoed in Lena's head. Not because she was terrified. Not exactly. But because she knew what surgery meant. Hospitals. Recovery. Bills. Still, she wasn't worried about that part. Her parents would handle it. They always did. Her father, Mark Carter, was a regional sales manager for a large manufacturing company. Her mother, Angela Carter, worked as a successful real estate agent. They lived comfortably. A large house in the suburbs. A new Tesla parked in the driveway. Vacations every summer. Money had never seemed like a problem. So when the nurse called her parents, Lena felt relieved. They would come. They would listen to the doctor. They would say yes. Problem solved. About 40 minutes later, Mark and Angela Carter walked into the hospital room. But something felt off. They weren't panicked. They weren't rushing to Lena's side. Instead, Mark's first words were directed at the doctor. "How serious is this?" Dr. Chin explained the condition clearly, calmly. Then she explained the treatment. "Surgery is the safest option," she said. "Without it, the obstruction could cause serious complications." Angela crossed her arms. Mark nodded slowly. Then he asked the question that made the room feel colder. "How much does it cost?" Dr. Chin hesitated slightly before answering. "With the procedure, anesthesia, and recovery, around $48,000 before insurance." Angela inhaled sharply. Mark looked at the floor. And then Angela said something Lena never expected to hear. "That's too expensive." For a moment, nobody spoke. Lena thought maybe she had misunderstood. Maybe her mom meant something else. Maybe she was just shocked. But then Mark added quietly, "We can't afford something like that right now." Lena stared at them from the hospital bed. Her mind struggled to make sense of the words. Too expensive? That didn't match the life they lived. Just 2 months earlier, they had spent nearly $9,000 on a ski vacation in Colorado. Last year, they renovated the kitchen. So why did this feel different? Dr. Chin remained professional. Well, your insurance will cover most of the procedure. The hospital billing department can explain the details. Angela shook her head quickly. We just need time to think. Time. But time was exactly what the doctor had said Lena didn't have. Lena lay quietly in the bed, pretending to scroll through her phone. But she was listening. Every word, every whisper outside the room. And then she heard something that made her stomach drop even harder than the pain. Her mother's voice. Low. Tense. Maybe it's not necessary right now. Lena froze. Not necessary? The doctor had said it was urgent. Why were they hesitating? Hours passed. Tests continued. Nurses checked on her. But the decision never came. Until late that evening, when a new doctor stepped into the room. He was older. Gray at the temples. Confident in the quiet way people become after decades of experience. Dr. Ravi Patel, chief surgeon at St. Augustine Medical Center. He picked up Lena's chart. Flipped through several pages. Then he looked at Lena. Then slowly turned toward her parents. And asked one calm, simple question. You said the surgery was too expensive? He paused, studying their faces carefully. Then he said something that made the air in the room change completely. That's interesting, because your insurance already approved it. And the expressions on Lena's parents' faces told him something was very, very wrong. But the real question wasn't about money. The real question was this. If the surgery was already covered, why were they still refusing? Why would parents refuse life-saving surgery when the insurance had already approved it? That was the question hanging in the hospital room like a storm cloud. Dr. Ravi Patel didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. But the moment he said those words, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. That's interesting, because your insurance already approved it. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Lena was sitting up slightly in the hospital bed, her hands gripping the thin blanket. Her stomach still ached in waves, but suddenly the pain wasn't the thing she was focused on anymore. She was watching her parents. And something about their reaction didn't make sense. Her mother, Angela Carter, blinked quickly. Too quickly. Like someone trying to buy time. Her father, Mark Carter, shifted his weight and cleared his throat. Well, approval doesn't mean everything is covered, he said. It sounded reasonable. But Dr. Patel had already done his homework. I spoke with your provider 15 minutes ago, he replied calmly. Emergency surgical procedures under this policy are covered at 90%. He turned the chart slightly so they could see it. That leaves roughly $4,800 out of pocket. $4,800. Not $48,000. Not the impossible number Lena had heard earlier. Just a fraction of it. For most families, that would still be stressful. But for the Carters? It didn't match the lifestyle Lena had grown up seeing. And that's when something strange happened. Mark Carter didn't look relieved. He looked cornered. Angela crossed her arms again. We still need time to think, she said. Dr. Patel tilted his head slightly. About a medically necessary emergency surgery? Silence. If you were in Lena's place, what would you be thinking right now? Because Lena's mind was racing. She remembered the Tesla her father bought last year. She remembered the Caribbean cruise her parents took for their anniversary. She remembered her mother casually buying designer handbags during shopping trips. And yet now, they were hesitating over something that could affect her life. The contradiction felt impossible. Dr. Patel glanced at Lena briefly. His tone softened slightly. Lena, how are you feeling right now? She hesitated. Still, pretty bad. Another wave of pain twisted through her stomach, as if to prove the point. Dr. Patel nodded. Then he looked back at the parents. The obstruction we're seeing can worsen quickly, he explained. Waiting increases the risk of complications. I would strongly recommend proceeding tonight. Mark rubbed the back of his neck. Angela stared at the floor. But neither of them said yes. And that was when Nurse Rosa Martinez noticed the look on Lena's face. Rosa had worked in hospitals for over 15 years. She'd seen every kind of family dynamic you could imagine. Fear, grief, panic. But this was something else. This looked like hesitation mixed with something deeper. Something they weren't saying. A few minutes later, Dr. Patel stepped out of the room to review lab results. The door closed behind him, and suddenly it was just Lena and her parents. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Lena finally asked the question sitting in her chest. "So, are we doing the surgery?" Angela gave a tight smile. "We're just exploring our options." Options. The word sounded strange in a situation like this. "What options?" Lena asked quietly. Mark stepped forward. "We might want another opinion first." Another opinion. For an emergency surgery. Even Lena, at 17, knew that didn't make sense. But before she could say anything else, Angela's phone buzzed. She stepped out into the hallway to answer it. Mark followed a moment later. The door didn't fully close. And that's when Lena heard it. At first it was just fragments. Whispers. Then the words became clearer. Angela's voice sounded sharp. "We can't just do this without thinking." Mark answered quietly. "If we refuse, people will start asking questions." Angela sighed. "And if we don't refuse, everything could fall apart." Lena's heart started beating faster. What did that mean? What could possibly fall apart because of her surgery? Then Mark said something that made the confusion even worse. "We've already planned everything for next year." Angela replied quickly. "I know. That's exactly why we can't let this ruin it." Ruin what? Lena felt a cold knot forming in her chest. This wasn't about money. It couldn't be. But if it wasn't money, then what was it? Before she could think further, Nurse Rosa stepped quietly into the room. She checked Lena's fore and gave her a reassuring smile. "You holding up okay?" Lena nodded, but her expression betrayed her confusion. Rosa lowered her voice slightly. "Your doctors are working on everything." Then she glanced toward the hallway where Lena's parents were still talking. And for just a moment, Rosa's expression changed. Concern. Because she had heard enough hallway conversations in her career to recognize when something wasn't right. A few minutes later, Dr. Patel returned. This time he carried a thin folder. Billing documentation. Insurance confirmation. He walked past Lena's bed and gestured toward the small consultation area in the corner of the room. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, may I speak with you for a moment?" They stepped inside. The door closed halfway. Dr. Patel placed the folder on the table. "I want to be completely transparent," he said. He slid the paperwork forward. "Your insurance policy is one of the most comprehensive plans offered by your employer." Mark looked at the documents. Angela didn't touch them. Dr. Patel folded his hands. "So if cost isn't the barrier here." He looked directly at Mark Carter. "What is?" The question hung in the air. Mark opened his mouth. Closed it again. Angela looked at him sharply. And that's when Dr. Patel noticed something in Lena's chart that made his expression shift. Something small. Something most people might overlook. But to an experienced surgeon who had spent decades reviewing medical records, it stood out immediately. He flipped back one page. Then another. His eyes stopped on a single line in the medical history. Blood type. Then he looked at Lena. Then slowly back at her parents. And the next question he asked would send the entire conversation in a direction no one in that room was prepared for. "Before we go any further," Dr. Patel said carefully, "there's something about Lena's records that I need to clarify." Mark frowned. Angela's posture stiffened. And Dr. Patel asked a question that made both parents freeze. "Lena, has anyone ever told you that you might be adopted?" "Lena, has anyone ever told you that you might be adopted?" For a second, the question didn't even make sense. It just hung there in the air. Heavy. Confusing. Almost absurd. Lena blinked at Dr. Patel, certain she had misheard him. "Adopted," she said with a small laugh. "No, of course not." Her voice sounded light, but something in the room had already shifted. Because while Lena laughed, her parents didn't. Angela Carter went completely still. Mark Carter's eyes flicked toward his wife so quickly it was almost automatic. And Dr. Patel noticed. Doctors are trained to notice small reactions. A change in breathing. A sudden silence. The look people exchange when they think no one is watching. And what he saw in that moment raised a very serious question. He closed Lena's chart slowly. "Interesting," he said. Mark's voice hardened immediately. "I'm not sure why that question is relevant to her surgery." The tension in the room thickened. But Dr. Patel remained calm. "It might not be," he said. "But sometimes medical history reveals important details." Angela stepped forward quickly. "This conversation isn't appropriate right now." Lena's eyes moved between them. First the doctor, then her parents. Her stomach twisted again, but now the pain felt different. Not just physical. Something deeper. "Wait," Lena said slowly. "Why would you even ask that?" Dr. Patel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned the chart toward himself and tapped one section lightly. "Blood type." Lena frowned. "Oh, positive," she said automatically. She donated blood at school the previous year. She remembered the nurse telling her. Dr. Patel nodded. "Yes. Oh, positive." Then he looked at Mark and Angela. "And according to the medical forms filled out today, Mr. Carter is AB positive and Mrs. Carter is A positive." For most people, those letters mean nothing. But in genetics, blood type combinations follow very specific patterns. Dr. Patel folded his hands. And while blood types can vary in families, he continued carefully, certain combinations make others extremely unlikely. Mark crossed his arms. "Unlikely doesn't mean impossible." "That's correct," Dr. Patel said calmly. "But when unlikely patterns appear alongside missing genetic history, we usually verify." Angela's voice was tight. "What are you suggesting?" Before he could answer, Nurse Rosa stepped back into the room carrying a small tray of blood sample tubes. "Doctor, the lab requested confirmation samples before surgery." "Perfect timing." Dr. Patel nodded. "Thank you, Rosa." He turned back toward Lena. "Standard procedure before anesthesia," he explained. "We confirm lab results." But Lena wasn't focused on the medical explanation anymore. She was staring at her parents. Because they looked terrified. Not worried. Not confused. Terrified. And that made her heart start pounding. "Mom," she said quietly. Angela forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just hospital paperwork." But the words didn't land the way they used to. 17 years of trust doesn't disappear instantly. But cracks can appear very fast. The nurse gently drew Lena's blood sample and labeled the tube. As she turned away, she glanced briefly at Dr. Patel. A silent exchange passed between them. Something wasn't adding up. And everyone in the room could feel it. 30 minutes later, Dr. Patel returned with the updated lab sheet. He stood near the foot of Lena's bed, reading carefully. Then he exhaled slowly. The kind of quiet breath someone takes before delivering difficult information. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he said, "I'd like to ask another question." Mark's jaw tightened. "Go ahead." Dr. Patel lifted the page slightly. The genetic markers in Lena's blood confirm something unusual. Angela's voice trembled. "What kind of unusual?" Dr. Patel didn't soften the statement. "Lena's genetic profile shows no compatible inheritance pattern with either of you." Silence. Absolute silence. Even the faint beeping of the monitor beside Lena's bed suddenly sounded louder. Lena stared at him. "What does that mean?" Dr. Patel looked directly at her. "It means that biologically, neither of them appears to be your genetic parent." The words felt like they landed in slow motion. Lena shook her head instinctively. "No, that's not right." She looked at her parents. Waiting. Expecting them to laugh. To explain. To correct the doctor. But they didn't. Angela's eyes filled with tears. Mark looked away completely. And that silence said more than any explanation ever could. Lena's voice cracked. "Mom?" Angela wiped her face quickly. "Lena, this isn't the time for this conversation." But that answer only made the room feel heavier. Because if it wasn't the time, then it meant there was something to say. Dr. Patel stepped slightly closer. "I understand this is unexpected," he said calmly. But the reason this became relevant is because your parents were hesitant about approving your surgery. Mark snapped suddenly. That has nothing to do with this. Then help me understand, Dr. Patel replied evenly. Because from a medical perspective, something didn't make sense. Parents who could afford treatment. Insurance that had already approved it. A daughter who needed urgent surgery. And yet they were still hesitating. Why? Angela covered her face briefly with her hands. Then she whispered something so quietly Lena almost didn't hear it. We didn't want this to come out like this. Lena's chest tightened. What didn't you want to come out? Angela looked at Mark. Mark looked at the floor. And suddenly the confident father Lena had always known seemed smaller. Cornered. Dr. Patel spoke again, gently but firmly. I think Lena deserves honesty right now. Angela nodded slowly. Her voice trembled. We were going to tell you someday. Lena's heart pounded harder. Tell me what? Angela took a shaky breath. 17 years ago, we couldn't have children. Lena felt the world tilt slightly. Angela continued. So we made a decision. Mark finally looked up again. And the words he said next shattered the life Lena thought she knew. You weren't born in Chicago, Lena. A pause. Then he added quietly. You were brought here. Lena's voice was barely a whisper. Brought here, from where? Mark hesitated. Angela answered instead. From another country. Lena stared at them, trying to process the words. Adoption. Another country. Secrets. But something about the way they were saying it still didn't feel complete. Because they looked afraid. Not just guilty. Afraid. And Dr. Patel noticed it too. Which is why he asked the next question. A question that made both parents visibly panic. Was the adoption handled through a licensed agency? Angela's face went pale. Mark didn't answer. And that silence told Dr. Patel something very serious. Because if the adoption wasn't handled legally, then Lena's medical records might be hiding far more than just her biological history. And suddenly the parents' hesitation about surgery started to make a terrifying kind of sense. But the real truth behind their fear was still about to come out. What kind of parents hesitate to approve life-saving surgery? That was the question echoing silently in Lena's mind. Because up until a few minutes ago, she thought she knew her family. Now, nothing made sense anymore. Her stomach still hurt. The obstruction was still there. The surgery was still urgent. But the pain inside her chest had suddenly become louder than the one in her abdomen. You were brought here, from another country. Those were the words her father had said. But they raised more questions than answers. Lena sat frozen in the hospital bed, staring at her parents as if they were strangers she had never met before. Where? She asked quietly. Angela wiped her eyes again. Romania, she whispered. Lena blinked. Romania. The word felt distant. Abstract. Like a location in a textbook rather than the beginning of her own life. You adopted me? Lena said slowly. Angela nodded. Yes. For a moment, Lena just sat there. Adoption itself wasn't shocking. Plenty of families adopt. But something about the way her parents looked right now told her the story wasn't that simple. Dr. Patel sensed it too. Mr. Carter, he said calmly, I asked whether the adoption was handled through a licensed agency. Mark ran a hand through his hair. His voice sounded strained. It wasn't exactly traditional. Not exactly traditional. That phrase hung in the air like a warning. Lena's heart began pounding again. What does that mean? She asked. Mark didn't answer. Angela did. Her voice was quiet and fragile. 17 years ago, we were desperate. She looked at Lena. We had spent years trying to have a child. Fertility treatments. Specialists. Procedures. Angela explained it all slowly, like someone pulling pieces of an old memory out of a locked box. Nothing worked, she said. The emotional toll had been enormous. Financially, they were already strained back then. And then someone introduced them to a private facilitator. A woman who arranged international adoptions. She told us she could help, Angela said. Dr. Patel's expression remained neutral, but he was listening very carefully. Because international adoptions require extensive documentation, government approvals, medical records. Legal transfers of custody. But something in Angela's tone suggested those steps hadn't happened the normal way. How old was Lena when she arrived in the United States? Dr. Patel asked. Angela hesitated. 3 weeks. Lena's mind struggled to process everything. 3 weeks old. So you adopted me as a baby, she said. Angela nodded quickly. Yes. That part sounded normal. But Mark suddenly spoke again, and the tension in his voice told a different story. The paperwork wasn't finalized the way it should have been. There it was. The missing piece. Dr. Patel leaned slightly forward. Meaning? Mark exhaled slowly. The agency shut down before the process was completed. Angela added quietly, the woman who arranged everything disappeared. Lena stared at them. You mean, the adoption wasn't legal? Angela shook her head quickly. No. We were listed as your guardians. Guardians. Not parents. A subtle difference legally. But a massive difference in certain official records. And that's when Dr. Patel understood exactly what the parents had been afraid of. Major surgery requires identity verification, blood testing, genetic screening, insurance documentation. And sometimes those tests reveal biological information that raises legal questions. Angela spoke again, her voice trembling. If the hospital started asking questions about Lena's records. She didn't finish the sentence. But the meaning was clear. They feared authorities might investigate the incomplete adoption, immigration paperwork, identity documentation, the possibility that Lena's origin story had legal gaps that could expose everything. Lena felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. So you weren't worried about the surgery cost? She looked directly at them. You were worried someone might find out. Neither parent answered. And that silence confirmed everything. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Lena asked the question that had been forming slowly in her chest. You were willing to delay my surgery, to protect yourselves? Angela shook her head quickly. No, that's not what we meant. But Mark didn't interrupt this time. And that hesitation spoke volumes. Nurse Rosa stepped closer to the bed. Her presence felt steady. Grounding. Lena, she said gently, none of this changes your right to medical care. Dr. Patel nodded. Your medical treatment is not dependent on adoption status or paperwork, he explained. We treat patients. That's our job. Angela looked up hopefully. So there won't be investigations? Dr. Patel didn't answer the way she expected. Our priority right now is Lena's health. Then he looked directly at Lena. And your surgery cannot wait. Another wave of pain twisted through Lena's stomach. A harsh reminder that the medical crisis was still very real. The emotional storm in the room had almost made everyone forget that. Dr. Patel turned to the parents again. I need consent to proceed. He placed the surgical authorization form on the small table. The paper looked deceptively simple. One signature. That was all. But right now it felt heavier than anything else in the room. Angela stared at the form. Mark stared at Lena. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, his confident voice was gone. Instead, he sounded unsure. Scared. What happens if questions come up later? He asked. Dr. Patel answered calmly. Then they'll come up later. His tone was firm. Measured. But right now, your daughter has a medical emergency. He slid the pen across the table. And then he asked the question that cut straight through every excuse left in the room. Are you going to let fear delay the surgery she needs? The silence that followed felt endless. Lena looked at both of them. Waiting. Hoping. Wondering whether the people she had called mom and dad for 17 years would finally choose her. Angela's hands trembled. Mark stared at the form. And the decision he made in the next few seconds would determine everything. Because one choice would save Lena's life. And the other would reveal exactly where their priorities truly were. If you were sitting in that hospital room, what would you do? Your daughter is lying in a hospital bed. She needs surgery. The doctors are ready. The paperwork is sitting on the table. And all that stands between her and the operating room is your signature. One decision. One moment. That's where everything stood in St. Augustine Medical Center that night. Mark Carter stared down at the consent form like it was written in a language he couldn't understand. The pen sat beside it, waiting. Angela stood beside him, her hands shaking slightly. Across the room, Lena watched them both. Her stomach still hurt. The obstruction hadn't magically disappeared while everyone argued. But the physical pain had become background noise. What mattered now was something deeper. For 17 years she had believed one simple truth. These two people would always choose her. Now she wasn't so sure. Dr. Patel broke the silence. "Every hour we delay increases the risk of complications," he said calmly. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. It was simply factual. And sometimes facts hit harder than emotions. Angela looked at Mark. "Sign it," she whispered. Mark didn't move. Instead, he asked the question that had been haunting him since the truth started coming out. What happens if someone investigates later? The room went quiet again. Nurse Rosa folded her arms. Dr. Patel answered carefully. "If there are irregularities in paperwork, those are administrative matters." Then he added something important. "But delaying a necessary medical procedure could have very serious consequences." The message was clear. This wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It was about responsibility. Lena finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Dad." Mark looked up. For a moment the tension in his face cracked. He saw not a problem, not a legal risk, just his daughter. The girl he had raised. The one who used to sit on his shoulders during parades. The one who cried the first day of kindergarten. The one he taught how to ride a bike. 17 years of memories. All standing right in front of him. And suddenly the fear that had been controlling him started to look very small. Mark picked up the pen. Angela exhaled shakily. The tip of the pen hovered above the paper. Then finally, he signed. Just like that. The moment passed quietly. No dramatic music. No applause. Just ink on paper. But that signature changed everything. Dr. Patel nodded once. "Thank you." The tension in the room shifted immediately. Nurse Rosa moved quickly, already preparing the next steps. "All right, Lena," she said gently. "We're going to get you ready." Within minutes, the hospital room turned into controlled motion. For lines checked. Medical forms completed. An anesthesiologist introduced himself. Lena was placed onto a rolling hospital bed. As the nurses began guiding her toward the hallway, she looked back at her parents. Angela squeezed her hand. "We're right here," she said softly. But Lena didn't answer. Not because she was angry. Not because she hated them. But because something inside her had changed. Trust, once cracked, doesn't instantly repair. The hallway lights passed overhead as they wheeled her toward the operating wing. Dr. Patel walked beside the bed. "You're going to be okay," he said calmly. Lena nodded. But her mind was somewhere else. Romania. Adoption. Secrets. Questions that had never existed before today. "Doctor," she asked quietly. "Yes." "If my adoption wasn't finished, does that mean you might be able to find my records?" Dr. Patel considered the question. "It's possible," he said. Then he added something careful. "Sometimes medical investigations reveal information families didn't expect." Lena stared at the ceiling again. Tonight had already revealed more than she ever imagined. The operating room doors opened. Bright lights. Sterile air. Machines humming softly. The surgical team moved with quiet efficiency. The anesthesiologist placed a mask over her face. "Count backwards from 10, he said. 10, 9, 8. The world faded. For hours later, Mark and Angela Carter sat in the waiting area. The chairs were uncomfortable. The clock moved slowly. Neither of them spoke much. Because both of them knew something important. The secret they had hidden for 17 years was now out. And they weren't sure what came next. Finally, the operating room doors opened. Dr. Patel stepped into the hallway. Mark stood up immediately. Angela held her breath. The surgeon removed his gloves. "The surgery went well," he said. The relief hit instantly. Angela covered her mouth. Mark sank back into the chair for a moment. The tension that had filled the entire night finally released. "She's going to recover fully," Dr. Patel continued. Angela's eyes filled with tears again. Thank you, she whispered. Hours later, Lena woke up in the recovery room. The lights were softer. The pain was dull now, controlled by medication. And sitting beside the bed were the two people who had raised her. Angela leaned forward. How are you feeling? Lena thought about the question. Physically? Better. But emotionally? That was more complicated. She looked at them carefully. Why didn't you tell me the truth before? Neither of them had a quick answer. Finally, Mark spoke. We were afraid. Lena nodded slowly. Of losing me? Angela shook her head. No. Her voice cracked. We were afraid of losing everything. That honesty landed differently than excuses. Lena leaned back against the pillow. Family, she realized, isn't as simple as biology. It's not as simple as paperwork either. It's messy, complicated, sometimes flawed. But it's also defined by moments. Moments where people decide who matters most. And tonight, eventually, her parents had chosen her. Weeks later, Lena would start asking new questions. About Romania. About her biological history. About the records that might still exist somewhere. Her story wasn't finished. Not even close. But one thing had become clear. Sometimes the most powerful moment in a hospital isn't the surgery. It's the question that forces people to reveal who they really are. And in Lena's case, one simple question from a surgeon had uncovered a truth hidden for 17 years. But the answers it revealed? Those were only the beginning of a much bigger story.